Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for coming to our event, Creating Knowledge in a Fragmented Age. Two people whom I love dearly told me that that was an absolute horrible title and would attract no one. So I'm thankful that, that many of you were still attracted. My name is Stephen Collis. I'm a law professor here at the University of Texas at Austin, where I'm also the faculty director of the Bech-Loughlin First Amendment Center. Our center's aim is to be the leading academic hub of its kind in the United States, and our mission is to advance knowledge of the First Amendment and to foster appreciation of its place in our society. We do that through promoting scholarship, debate, a legal clinic, deliberation, dialogue, education, book launches, conferences, and lectures related to all of the freedoms of the First Amendment. And of course, those include the freedoms of religion, speech, and the press, as well as the right to peacefully assemble and petition the government. So as scholars in this field will know, we debate and explore these freedoms constantly, their boundaries, their limits, what forms they should take, how they apply to our modern circumstances, what methodologies we should use to answer those questions, their origins, and perhaps just as important, their theoretical and philosophical justifications. And at least one of those justifications is that each of these freedoms relates to humanity's efforts to pursue truth and to create and discover knowledge of that truth. But to do that and to truly use all of these freedoms for that end, we need institutions, norms, and systems that make it possible, and we need to understand the technological and ideological barriers in our way. That is why tonight, the First Amendment Center, in partnership with our co-sponsors, the Athenaeum and the Civitas Institute, is pleased to host two of the nation's leading thought leaders on those topics. I'll introduce them now and then let you know how the evening is going to go. Jonathan Rauch, wave Jonathan Rauch, please. A senior fellow at the Brookings Institution in Washington, is the author of 8 books and many articles on public policy, culture, and government. He is a contributing writer for The Atlantic and recipient of the 2005 National Magazine Award, the magazine industry's equivalent of the Pulitzer Prize. His latest book, published in 2021 by the Brookings Press, is called The Constitution of Knowledge, A Defense of Truth, a spirited and deep-diving account of how to push back against disinformation, canceling, and other new threats to our fact-based epistemic order. And I'll just add that on the Audible version of his book, his narrator is the same narrator who did the Audible version of my last 2 books, so it must be good. Jonathan Haidt, doesn't need to wave because Rauch already did, is a social psychologist at New York University's Stern School of Business. He received his PhD from the University of Pennsylvania in 1992. His research examines the intuitive foundations of morality. He is the author of 3 critically acclaimed books and more than 100 academic articles, has given 4 TED Talks, and in 2019 was inducted into the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Since 2018, he has been studying the contributions of social media to the decline of teen mental health and the rise of political dysfunction. His next book is called The Anxious Generation: How the Great Rewiring of Childhood is Causing an Epidemic of Mental Illness. It launches next month and can be pre-ordered now. We're going to first hear from Jonathan Haidt, followed by John Rauch. Then the 3 of us will have a moderated discussion period, and after that we'll open it up for Q&A. And when we get to that point, I'll explain how the Q&A is going to work. So please help me welcome Jonathan Haidt and Jonathan Rauch.
Well, thanks so much to you, the audience. Thanks to you, Steve, for inviting us here and to your center. Just three preliminaries that I want to do. One is I'm having some vocal cord problems, and I'm also getting over a cold. So that's why I'm using a microphone different from the rest of them. I have to talk quietly into a mic. The second, let me just get a sense of who's here in the audience. Raise your hand, because we can barely see you with the lights in our eyes. Raise your hand if you're a student in any way, shape, or form. Okay, good, a lot of students. Raise your hand if you're a parent, if you have children, let's say if children under 22. Okay, good, a lot of parents too. All right, because there's a lot of things we can talk about. And while we're mostly gonna talk about knowledge, universities, epistemic issues, all I'm thinking about these days is what social media has done to the younger generation, so I'll mention that at some point. The third preliminary is to say that, it's very common. We think like, oh, you're going to have a panel discussion. You should have people with disagreeing views, and let's see if they can model civil conversation. Jonathan Rauch and I disagree on almost nothing.
You're wrong about that, John. We'll find something.
But there's a different kind of talk where you get people who might generally have the same outlook, but they come from different backgrounds and bring different expertise. And so what you're going to get tonight is, I think, really complementary analyses. And that's literally like what our partnership is. Like, we've each really influenced the other, as you'll see. I come at it as a social psychologist, really interested in sociology. John comes at it as a very broad public intellectual who's written about so many issues related to democracy and what's going wrong with aspects of it. And so we're always delighted when we get a chance to be together and to talk tonight about some of the biggest problems our country is facing. Okay, so those are the preliminaries. What I thought I would do with my 10 minutes or so is tell you like the evolution of my thinking about where we are, because when you put things in a story, it's sort of easier to follow. And what I'm going to do in this story is I'm going to give you two metaphors, which are about the gravitational constant and the Tower of Babel. And I'm going to use those to address issues in America's liberal democracy, in universities, and for Gen Z, for people born after 1995. So I've always loved being a professor, and I was a professor at UVA for many years, and then I moved to NYU Stern in 2011, and I thought it was the greatest job on earth, and it still is. But things really changed in 2015. It began 2014, but something went really wrong, haywire, weird, strange, right around 2014, 2015. And my friend Greg Lukianoff really noticed it, was one of the first to analyze it. He saw that students were thinking in ways that were exactly the ways he had learned to not do when he learned CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, for depression. Greg is prone to depression. Students were catastrophizing, overgeneralizing, black and white thinking, all the whole catalog of psychiatric analyses of the thinking that depressed and anxious people do. And they were seeing threats in books and words and speakers and saying, if the speaker comes, there will be, people will die. Like, really, how will they die? And so Greg and I wrote an article called The Coddling of the American Mind. It was published in The Atlantic in 2015. And we thought, okay, we diagnosed this strange thing going on. And then a few months later, campuses really blew up, and beginning especially in that famous courtyard scene at Yale that some of you may have seen the video of. So from 2015 through, I would say, December of 2023, that is just last December, there is what, I've been calling a cultural revolution. I only hesitate because, Chris Rufo and others are using that term, but it really was a cultural revolution, very similar to the Chinese Cultural Revolution, an attempt to destroy old ideas and replace them with new, and there were a lot of similarities. So what the hell was happening on campus? That's what I was thinking, like, what's happening? And then it spread off campus, and a lot of the same dynamics hit all of our epistemic institutions. So the same dynamics about speech as violence and safe spaces, it hit journalism, media, the arts. If it involved ideas and creative people working together, it was hit by the very same thing. As Andrew Sullivan wrote, "We all live on campus now." He said that in 2018. And as I was thinking, like, what is happening to us? Why is everything going crazy? We need good journalism. We need researchers. What is happening to us? And I came up with this metaphor to convey the scope of the change that I was seeing in society. And it was if any of you remember your high school physics class or college physics class, there are about 25 constants all over our universe. These are true. And one of them is the gravitational constant. It's the degree to which mass attracts mass. And so the metaphor is, what if one day, around the early 2010s, God decided that he was just kind of bored, 14.5 billion years with the same settings? Let's have some fun. And so he just doubles the gravitational constant one day. And all throughout the universe, gravity is now 2 or 4 or 8, I don't know what it would be, whatever. It's a lot stronger. What would happen? What would happen is our bridges would collapse, birds would fall from the sky, planes would fall from the sky, everything would go haywire. And I thought, yeah, that's it. That's the metaphor. So I was invited to give a talk at the Manhattan Institute, and I decided to give this big talk. I've been long concerned about America's liberal democracy, about how e pluribus unum is a miracle. It's a magic trick. It's very hard to get right. And we never got it fully right, but man, we were making a lot of progress. And compared to other countries, we were doing pretty well. And I was alarmed that we could fall apart. And so I gave this talk, which was a very sort of alarmist talk about what could happen, and I used that metaphor. And John was in the audience, and he heard. We knew each other already, but he heard that, and he'll say how that influenced him. But then he went. It was inspired by that metaphor to write this incredible book, The Constitution of Knowledge. And then he sent me drafts of it. And you were begging me to read it because you needed my input on the thing. And I was like, oh no, I'm too busy. I'm writing a book. But then I finally read the few key chapters, and then I was completely blown away. And I realized, oh my God, this is what's happening to us. There's something going wrong with our epistemic institutions. I hadn't used the word epistemology much. It's like the study of knowledge. How do we get knowledge? But John really showed the miracle by which good knowledge can be created and how hard it is to get the right institutions and settings. So I read his book, and then I started thinking, oh my God, this is what's going on with universities. And then I coined the phrase structural stupidity based on John's work. Not that he it does but structural stupidity is what happens when you have a group of smart people, but people are afraid to speak up. But bad ideas will go unchallenged. And that's what I was seeing all around me in the academic world. People could say ridiculous things, and if it was on the correct side politically, no one would dare question it. It's not true all over the university, but in social sciences, humanities. So I started working on this, and as I was thinking about this, and I got more and more alarmed about how our settings are out of bounds, and so I got a contract to write a book on this, and I moved on to another metaphor. So it's the second one is Babel, and this is even better. At least I think so. Let's see what you think. Because it's not just things are going haywire. It's more specific. It's that we can't understand each other anymore. It's that people can say things that are just obviously crazy, but people in their bubble seem to believe it, and we're all like this. And so the metaphor, the Babel story, is this incredible story, very, very short in Genesis. And the key line is, God sees that the humans, the descendants of Noah, they're building a great city with a tower to reach unto the heavens. And God says, now they will be like us. They will become like gods. And he says, let us go down and confuse their language so that they may not understand one another. And when I reread that, I said, that's the line. That's what's happened to us. We can't understand one another. And the reason why, I believe, is because we have left the Gutenberg era, which began with the printing press in the 1450s, 1460s, had a couple hundred years of war and chaos, and it wasn't all good. But eventually what came out of it, and you'll get this from John's book, what came out of it was a set of institutions based on print, which is stable. It can be sent around. Scientists can write things and send them around Europe or wherever, and you get progress. The Gutenberg era, I believe, is over. I think it ended in 2014. That's when the network era really begins. You start getting crazy stuff like global cancellation campaigns. That wasn't happening in 2010. By 2013, Justine Sacco, that woman who flew to South Africa and then was fired by the time she landed, that was December 2013. That was the first of those, and there have been a lot of them ever since. There was some new parameter by which outrage, craziness could just spread around the world. It was as if God had doubled the gravitational coefficient. It was as if the Tower of Babel had been knocked over. So that's what I've been thinking about, how the move from the Gutenberg era, which is the era in which our liberal democracy was designed to withstand the known problems of democracy, which are the rage of people, the passions of people, their tendency to follow demagogues. Institutional supports were put in, processes to cool those passions. Those all made sense during the Gutenberg era. I don't think they will work in the network. I don't think they are working in the network era. So actually, this is something where you and I do disagree. Is I'm more pessimistic about the future of the country than John is. So I urge you to listen to me, but be sure that he speaks last so that you can go home happy. I'll stop there. There's a lot more I can say about Gen Z and universities, but I'll stop there and pass it over to John.
Well, thank you. I don't know if any of you are old enough to remember this, but I think was it 1975 when Elizabeth Taylor at the Academy Awards was about to present one of the big awards, and a streaker on national television ran stark naked across the stage behind her. That's what streaking was, for those who are young to know about that fad. And Elizabeth Taylor, without missing a beat, said, "That's what I call a hard act to follow." Well, that's what I call a hard act to follow. But I'll tell a story of my own. I'll try to be equally brief. My story leads, however, not to a metaphor, but to an actual thing that sounds like a metaphor. And the actual thing that sounds like a metaphor is the constitution of knowledge. And it's about where knowledge comes from in a truth-oriented, peaceful, prosperous, and politically stable, that is, non-war-oriented society. But I'll get there in a minute. I want to tell you just a word about how I got there, which is the story that John Haidt just told you is true. Around the same time as he was noticing the gravitational constant changing on a lot of campuses, I was noticing some of the same changes or related changes in media. Now, what I'm about to say will seem to some of you like a partisan comment. I think it's simply a factual comment, but take it as you will. We saw in 2016, for the first time, the emergence of a presidential candidate who, according to PolitiFact, the fact checkers, of the statements that he made in the campaign that were fact-checkable, 70% were mostly or entirely false. For his opponent, Hillary Clinton, the comparable number was 25%. That's too high, but maybe it's what you expect in a presidential campaign. 70%, think about that. What it would require for any of you to go around on any given day and 70% of what you say be factually false. Instead of being called on this, and instead of being rejected politically for this person was elected president and went on to utter, by the Washington Post fact checkers count, 35,000 falsehoods over the course of his presidency. That's 20 a day, all leading to the Stop the Steal campaign, which was entirely based on falsehood at the end of 2020. Meanwhile, we saw the rise of cable news, which was using some of the same methods to depart from truth. And meanwhile, over in academia, which is left-wing and not right-wing, we'd seen postmodernism for a while, and those were some ideas that questioned the validity of the idea of objective truth, and sometimes, John may agree, questioned them in healthy ways. Led to some important dialogue. But we began to see the sciences become distorted by ideas that said you had to find results that politically came out on one side or the other. We saw journals that began to say you can't issue ideas here that might be harmful in our judgment to minorities. You began to see students who used to be pro-free speech saying that they did not want to be exposed to harmful ideas. And you began to see a splintering in the American public of what it is that we regard as true. For any human society, large or small, coming to some kind of reasonable consensus about truth that is accurate and reasonably broadly accepted is maybe the hardest social challenges. Most societies schism over this, or they settle disputes by one side predominates and annihilates, imprisons, or exiles the other. That's usually how it's been done. You have to settle that process with a system of some sort or another. You don't have to agree on everything. Raise your hand. Let's see. Raise your hand if you believe in ghosts or witches. Don't be ashamed. A few people do. Raise your hand if you believe in astrology. Just one or two takers for that? Raise your hand if you think the Earth is or might be flat. Why are you laughing? So here are the numbers. 40% of Americans believe in ghosts or witches. 25% believe in astrology. And 9% believe that the Earth is or might be flat. 2% think it is flat. 7% think it might be. That by itself is not a good thing, but it won't destroy our country. But there are things that we need to come to conclusions on as a society in order to run the country. And they involve things like who won the last election. These are key matters on which it is important to have a workable public consensus, and we were losing that. And I'm wondering why this is happening. And along comes this social psychologist of all people giving a talk at Manhattan Institute who says to run a liberal democracy, it doesn't just happen automatically. You have to get a lot of very particular settings right, and that's what the founders were trying so hard to do in the US Constitution. When those settings go wrong, the system doesn't work. And I begin thinking, okay, so what are the settings? And here's where I wind up. I won't go through the whole book and all the ideas, but I want to introduce a concept. So how does a society come to a workable, fact-based notion of truth? You need rules to do it. It turns out an unstructured marketplace of ideas is necessary but not sufficient. Just people talking to each other is Twitter. It's social media. It leads to a race to the bottom, to chaos, to posturing, to trolling, all the other ways people seek status online. You need a lot of structure to do this right. You need to train people to do experiments, for example, in the sciences, to write papers in a certain way with hypotheses that can then be checked. You need to inculcate them and acculturate them in ways to do this, not just in academia, but also journalists need how to be taught to do this. That's what I was taught at a series of newspapers and magazines. How to check sources. What has news value? How many sources do you need? When do you go with anonymous sources? All of that stuff. It's difficult to learn and it's expensive. To build that kind of society requires an epistemic constitution, a constitution of knowledge, and that's not a metaphor. It's not just like a constitution. These are actual rules. They're not all written down in one place like the US Constitution. They're written down in a lot of places. But things like the Association of Newspaper Editors Ethics Codes, the so-called Red Book of the American Society of, what is it called? The Professors Association? The Professors Union. Anyway, AAUP, thank you. They have a Red Book, which has the rules for academic freedom. They're in the rules that a lot of universities have. They're in the bylaws of the scientific journals. These are the things that teach us how to relate to each other when it comes to making knowledge in very specific ways, and you've got to get them right, or you'll just be a bunch of people talking to each other. There are three of them that are especially important, and they closely mirror the three in the US Constitution because the systems are very similar. They both rely on civil persuasion to come to consensus. The US Constitution, you need freedom of speech in order to influence your government and each other. You need rule of law. Even when you lose, you've got to be willing to go with the outcome in court or in politics, and you need diversity of faction. You have to have, as Madison said, a large republic with different voices. Otherwise, one faction can too easily take control. In parallel, in the Constitution of Knowledge, to run a healthy epistemic society, you need three things. The first is freedom of inquiry. You've got to be able to float hypotheses of all kinds of different types, and some of them will be offensive and hurtful to some people, and that's just how it is. It's a cost of the system. The second thing you need is viewpoint diversity. If everyone in the room agrees on their assumptions, learning won't happen because key assumptions won't be questioned. So you need more than one opinion. You need a lot of different opinions on campus. That means you need conservatives, not just people on the left, or learning won't take place. And third, the equivalent of lawfulness. You need, Third, yes, sorry. You need factfulness. You need the discipline of fact. Freedom of speech is not enough. As lawfulness is to the U.S. Constitution, factfulness is to the Constitution of knowledge. That means you don't make things up, you don't cut corners, you don't plagiarize. If you're a journal editor, you look at whether the science is good, not whether the science is politically correct. You must have those three things in order for the Constitution of knowledge to work. All three of them have been severely diminished, both in academia and in media. But I worry most right now about academia. We've seen problems with freedom of speech. You don't need me to tell you that. You've also seen problems with factfulness, as we're seeing journalists and faculties that are restricting what you can say and what you can conclude, and in some cases actually modifying facts in order to come to conclusions that they find politically adequate. And you need viewpoint diversity. And there are entire disciplines now in which it is possible. Jonathan Haidt will tell me if I'm exaggerating. Maybe I am, but I think it is possible to go from undergraduate through graduate school, through dissertation, granting of your first job, all the way through tenure and retirement in certain fields without encountering anyone who has voted for a Republican. Is that a true statement?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I mean, at Harvard, I think the recent finding was 99% of donations went to Democrats. From when faculty made donations, 99% were to Democrats.
So to me, the question that's before us, both in society and in academia, and the question, especially for the many students in the room, that you're all going to be dealing with for your careers, many of you will be in a knowledge industry. That will be academia, journalism, law, government, museums, libraries, all based in this world. Can we reconstitute these critical norms, the Constitution of knowledge, in a fragmented age, in a world of social media, in a world of demagoguery, and in a world where much of academia seems to have cut itself adrift from these principles?
All done, right? So we do have a problem up here, which is that the three of us largely agree on all of this, and we need some heterodox views. So allow me to be the devil's advocate, so you can address it, right? John, you're fond of quoting Mill, who says, "He who knows only his own side of the case knows little of that," right? This just blew up. I think you went to Yale, I think, right, John? Just this last week at Yale, you had a faction of faculty who wrote a letter saying we need to get back to what you just described, the Constitution of knowledge. And you had a large contingent of other faculty who signed a different letter who said, it's a myth to say that universities ever were these places of excellence and a true Constitution of knowledge. What they had were legacy admits, they admitted only white men, they underserved much of the community. They were never truly about purely seeking truth, but they were serving only certain communities. And going forward, we need to fix that. We need to adjust whom we admit. We need to ensure that we are looking out upon society and seeing where there are great problems and trying to solve those and using these grand institutions to meet social justice ends and to help eradicate injustice and inequality. And the argument is, you know, we've never truly been these great epistemic institutions, so let's stop pretending we were. Let's pursue excellence, but let's also pursue social justice at the same time. Now, if I have not stated that in its best form, please make it stronger. But that is the argument, I think, coming from a lot of people, in certain disciplines especially, about what universities should be, that they're not just about truth, they should serve other purposes. How would you respond, either of you?
Can we poll the room on that question?
Yeah.
Is there a concise
I can't
way to...
see anybody, but
If I do this, I can see many of you. Please don't let us up here on the stage prejudice your answers. Please be candid about this. And let's see if I can frame the question this way. I'm going to ask you to raise your hand if you think that a university's primary mission is something related to advancing social justice. That's number one. Number two...
So are you asking is or should be?
Should be. That its primary mission should be to advance social justice in some form. Second, that its primary mission should be to advance truth however you define that, but in some rigorous form. Is that okay so far? The third, if you think it's a false choice. And fourth, if you don't know. Is that an okay way to frame it?
Sure.
Okay, let's just get a sense of the room. Again, no one's being graded on this. No one's going to be judged on this. In fact, up here we can't even really see you. So raise your hand if you think that the primary mission of a university should be social justice oriented. Did not a single hand go up?
Well, these are all people who chose to come see you.
Yeah, I was going to say, clearly a skewed audience.
Okay, yeah, I'm going to say okay, raise your hand if you think the primary mission should be pursuit of truth in some reasonably defined way. That's half the room. Raise your hand if you think it's a false choice. And raise your hand if you're not sure, don't know. So that's interesting. Okay, on this stage, same question. Can we do this? And then I'll turn the hard part over to you. You can actually answer the challenge. On this stage, raise your hand if you think that the primary mission should be social justice in some form. No takers. Raise your hand if you think it should be pursuit of truth. Okay, so that's us up here. So that's my answer is that universities wear multiple hats. They do a lot of different things. They are research institutions, they are teaching institutions, they are residences where people do need to feel safe. They are social connecting and acculturating machines where young people learn how to be human and wake up and go to class. But I think that the single thing that society needs universities to do that no one else can do is pursue truth in a rigorous way. And that those other things, while important, I don't disagree entirely with the letter that the Yale professors read. I mean, I'm gay. And when I went through college, people like me were in the closet. There was a small handful of people in the Gay-Straight Alliance. I'm very glad universities are more diverse than they are. But I think their diversity should not at least come at the expense of the core mission. But over to you.
So I appreciate it is helpful to have the devil's advocate position stated. And I guess I would say, first of all, a university, I'm a professor in a business school now, so I think I have a lot of language that I didn't have 10 years ago. Higher ed had possibly the best brand on planet Earth. People wanted to come from all over the world because our universities were the best in the world. There's 2 in Britain, and the rest are American in all the lists of the top universities. And that brand depended critically on 2 features. There were 2 features of it. One is intellectual excellence, and the other is absolute honesty. It is a sin beyond description for a professor to say something that he knows to be false, or to publish something especially that either he knows to be false or he doesn't have the data to back up. And that was our brand for a long time. And if you look at Gallup data, even in 2015, Democrats had a very positive view of higher ed, and Republicans had a mildly positive view. And since 2015, it has plummeted, not just for Republicans, but for moderates and centrists, and it's even fallen for Democrats. And this was all before all the fiascos of last semester of October 7th and 8th, and then the hearings with the 3 presidents. So higher ed has destroyed its brand. We are not trusted by Americans. We desperately need sources of knowledge that can be trusted because they are trustworthy, and we don't have them anymore. And John and I are both lamenting the fact that we need great universities, and they have serious problems. We both think they're fixable, but they have serious problems right now. A lot of those problems can be traced directly to the mission confusion of, are we organized to pursue truth, or are we organized to pursue social justice? The claim that we didn't used to be, there was no golden age, of course not. There never is. These are real human institutions. They're never perfect. They used to be exclusionary. Yeah, but ever since I got in, we've been so focused on diversity and inclusion. It's been the top priority, at least since the 90s when I joined. So it's not as though we've been exclusionary and we need this big push for for restructuring for more diversity. We've been doing that for a long, long time. And let's see, what's the other part? The power thing. So power is sometimes the relevant analytical lens. Sexuality is sometimes the lens. Money is sometimes the lens. A college education should teach you many different lenses to look at problems through. And what happens when you get a commitment to social justice, at least in the modern American sense, is that it's identitarian. That is, social justice now, it has a lot of meanings over the last couple hundred years. There's Catholic social justice. But what we mean on campus by social justice is identitarianism. That is, we teach students that the most important, there's only one lens, and it is power based on identity groups. If you look out at the audience, don't see human beings. You see a white man, that means he's powerful and bad. You see a black woman, that means she's a victim and good. This is a sick thing to teach. It's inaccurate. It's destructive. It makes it impossible to have a diverse multi-ethnic democracy where people can function together. And it's just dishonest. And so what happens, what I think we saw happening, what's really come to the public consciousness, is that the commitment to social justice, while it could in theory produce, social justice itself could in theory produce great things, but when a university says, we're going to actually elevate diversity, equity, inclusion above truth and excellence, what you get is a president of Harvard chosen entirely because of her category. She has no scholarly accomplishments, and what she has published was plagiarized. And even still, the Harvard Corporation backed her, and other professors said, well, it's not really plagiarism. In other words, Harvard was a spectacular case where the top university for excellence and honesty, their motto is literally veritas. That university was exposed as promoting incompetence and dishonesty. And even when called on it, they didn't back down. They said, we're with incompetence and dishonesty. And you wonder why people don't trust American universities anymore. So I don't think it's a false choice. I think in theory, well, no, not even in theory. I think it's not a false choice. Each organization has a telos, a purpose, a highest goal around which it is organized. And universities are structured to pursue knowledge. Yes, we don't do it perfectly. We never did, we never will. But man, it was a lot better 15 years ago than it has been since 2015, when dishonesty and fear crept in. A lot of us are teaching on eggshells. There's an incredible conversation, Barry Weiss talking to Roland Fryer, who did, this amazing young black economist at Harvard. He set out to see after Ferguson whether the police actually are more likely to kill black people than white people once they're engaged, and he found that there's really no difference. Well, what happened? He had to have armed guards. He had to have a police guard. For publishing this work, he was so reviled, he was actually in danger. And you listen to Roland Fryer talk, he had no partisan leanings. He was just after the truth. It's a really beautiful interview. And the fact that, and it happened to be at Harvard, and the fact that the academic world reacts, if you get the wrong result, we're going to destroy you. And guess who his main persecutor was? It was Claudine Gay. So I think social justice as we have it now is incompatible with the pursuit of truth.
So at least a third of you thought that it was a false choice. So when we get to the Q&A, if any of you would like to challenge them on the notion that it is that they're mutually exclusive, I'd love for you to do so. Don't be afraid to come up and challenge. I want to shift gears a little bit. And I suppose this might start with you, Jonathan Haidt, but then John Rauch, I'd love for you to comment on the kind of misinformation part of it. So even if we agree on how we create knowledge, and even if we agree that we need some institutions that would follow this, truth above all else. It seems today that smartphones and social media are making many people, and especially young people, almost incapable of dealing with that environment. And I wonder if, John Haidt, you could talk about your research into that, the state of Gen Z, but I think also others. Why is it that we live in a world that people seem to accept all sorts of misinformation in ways that maybe they always did, maybe they didn't in the past, but I'd like if you could talk about that and the role of smartphones in particular.
So I was just listening to a podcast. Jeffrey Rosen was talking with Andrew Sullivan, and Jeffrey Rosen has a book out. I think it's called The Pursuit of Happiness, but it's about what the founding fathers read and their ideas, and you see the incredible role of books, great books, in the thinking of people who do great things. And creative people read. They read a lot of books, and most of us in this audience are grateful to books that have informed us. It takes a while to build new mental structures, and so you need deep immersion in something. And it's really hard. And then what happens? Now, of course, pop culture has been coming in for a long time. It's distracting. It's vapid. The shows that we watched when we were kids, like I Dream of Jeannie. I showed some to my kids. This is the stupidest thing I've ever seen. Like television today is much more complex and interesting than it was when we were kids. So I don't want to say like, oh, it was good. Everything was good in our day. But when you shift from what I'll call long-form video, which is at least 25 minutes, and a lot of it was 50 minutes or movies. When you shift from long-form video to 30-second videos, this is something I'm really focusing on now. Netflix is great for a lot of reasons, and when I ask my students, do you wish you lived in a world with no Netflix? Nobody says yes. But they're addicted not to Netflix, they're addicted to TikTok and Instagram Reels and YouTube Shorts. And I ask them, we talk about how much damage it does to them, and I say, would you rather live in a world where they were never invented? And they say, yes, we wish this was never invented. We didn't have to watch it to keep up with what everybody else is doing. There's a fragmentation of consciousness and attention when you're just getting short snippets of things that don't add up to anything, that were chosen by an algorithm, not for their truth or worth in education, but entirely for the degree to which they made people click, mostly emotional intensity. So I'm extremely alarmed by the change from sort of, you go from like the Gutenberg era, the TV era, you've got different technology that have different effects. But the smartphone and social media era, smartphones by themselves are not so destructive. They're incredibly useful tools. But smartphones loaded with all these apps that are competing for kids' attention, that is what's producing a generation that can't possibly be expected to come up with a coherent worldview. All they've been fed is bits of outrage, comedy, and degradation. I mean, the degradingness of a lot of the videos showing people being killed or falling out of buildings or doing, horrible things. I mean, those are my concerns about how the changing media environment is really changing child development, especially adolescent development.
And Jonathan Rauch, if you could talk about, I think a related problem is the rise of misinformation. And in particular, I don't know if you spent much time exploring this, but foreign actors using all of this technology to try to spread misinformation and divide people.
Yeah, the second half of my book, The Constitution of Knowledge, the first half sets up what I told you about, which is there is a Constitution of Knowledge. What are the rules? How does it work? Why is it important? Why is it the foundation for our whole society? But the second half is about the challenges that we face, and those include high-tech challenges like social media, and they also include social manipulations like canceling, which can be done on or off social media. And then another is the deployment of age-old propaganda techniques like Russian-style mass disinformation, which is not new by any means. It's over 100 years old, but which has been turbocharged by the availability of channels that make it very cheap and easy to broadcast misinformation and disinformation on a global scale at the push of a button. And it will soon be possible for artificial intelligence to develop mis and disinformation, test it in real time, customize it to individuals, show you a video created specifically for you that looks real but is entirely false, to persuade you to vote on Wednesday instead of Tuesday. And we're really not ready for that. I do try to emphasize when I talk about this that although the modalities are new, obviously TikTok is new, the smartphone is pretty new, that the underlying means of manipulating humans cognitively so that they can be either persuaded of things that are false or what is usually the actual goal, because false persuasion isn't all that easy. What is much easier is to confuse and demoralize. So people no longer know what's true or what's false. They give up, they become cynical, they stay home. I don't really know who won the 2020 election. We'll never know. I've seen so much from so many sources, I don't know who to believe. Those techniques are ancient. They are very old. Understanding those techniques, what it is people are trying to do to our minds, and how sophisticated and powerful these tools are, is itself a form of inoculation. So one of the things I emphasize is the importance of media literacy, digital literacy, helping students and adults understand how they're being manipulated. Another way is to make sure our institutions become stronger and better prepared for dealing with these threats. They are much better, media, for example, is much better prepared to deal with foreign disinformation than it was in 2016 when it took us by surprise. It's still a problem, but now we have reporters who cover it full time. Foreign actors are a problem. Russia's number one. It's the best in the world at this. They are super sophisticated, and if you think you can spot Russian disinformation, think again. They're smarter than you are about this. But Iran and China are right behind. North Korea's in this game. But I'm going to say, again, some of you will say this is partisan. I don't think so, but make your own judgment. By far, the biggest, most audacious, and most successful Russian-style mass disinformation campaign that has ever been waged against the American public by any actor, domestic and foreign, is the Stop the Steal campaign waged by Donald Trump and his MAGA movement. It has been successful in persuading 2/3 of Republicans and a significant share of independents that the safest election, the securest election probably in American history, came out wrong, that it was distorted and stolen. That kind of psychological misinformation, disinformation, is fundamentally incompatible with running a democracy because it has persuaded most of one political party that America no longer is a democracy. And for those of you in the room who are in your teens or 20s, God bless you, because you're going to spend your careers understanding how to adapt the norms and institutions that we're not able to cope with this onslaught, how to adapt them so that we can do better.
So, Jonathan Haidt, to that point, I guess, what are some, as you look at social media, as you look at cell phones, the effect they're having on people, creating what I would say is a fertile ground for misinformation to take root and spread. What are some solutions? What can people do in their own lives? What can institutions do?
Let's see, so solutions. I'm much better at analyzing threats and telling people to be very afraid, I guess, than I am at solutions. So like, on what it's doing to kids, actually there are solutions. That one we can actually solve. And you know what? Actually, if you don't mind, I'll say that now because this is part of the issue. So, since a lot of the problem is that kids need to grow up in the real world, they need to have a lot of face-to-face experience, they need to engage with each other, and around 2012, we went from having more of a real-world childhood where they were interacting with each other. They had flip phones, but it was hard to type on a flip phone, so you'd say, see you at 3, and you'd meet up at 3. We went from that to a phone-based childhood, and that is warping so many aspects of development, including cognitive development. Academic progress was increasing for many decades till 2012. It's been dropping since 2012. It wasn't just COVID. It was actually the phones, in part. So what I'm doing in my book, The Anxious Generation, is saying the reason we got stuck in this, the reason why people are doing this, the reason why young people are spending so much time, even though they themselves wish they didn't spend that much time, is because we're stuck in a series of collective action traps. And the 4 norms that would get us out are no smartphones until high school, just give kids flip phones, and we've got to protect middle school. The second is no social media till 16. Let's let kids get through the early stages of puberty, brain development, cognitive development, begin to learn how to use media before dropping him in this whirlpool of garbage. The third is phone-free schools. Kids really can't pay attention to teachers or each other if everything is coming through their phone while they're in class. How many of you here are under the age of 24? Raise your hand. Okay, now of those who raised their hand, how many of you sometimes texted during class in high school? Raise your hand. Okay, and how many of you never did that? Raise your hand. Okay, so most of you were texting.
Like one guy over here.
Yeah.
And he was betting on the horses.
That's right. You were watching porn or something. So there's just no excuse for letting students have a phone in their pocket. So my point is, we can't improve social media to the point where it's not toxic. The medium is the problem, and so we simply have to greatly delay when kids have this immersion into 12, 15 hours a day of screen time. That is a solution that will prepare the next generation to think more deeply, to have at least a period of normal brain development before their brains are taken over by rivers of stuff from their phones. So that's part of the solution, is however hard it is for adults, it's much harder for young people to pay attention because they don't have 10 minutes uninterrupted very often. They're constantly being pinged, constantly checking. So the youth mental health and the Gen Z issues, we can solve, and we can basically solve them in a year or two. At least we can put in place new norms. The democracy problems are much, much harder, much harder. And where I've thought about this, I have an Atlantic article a year and a half ago or 2 years ago called Why the Past 10 Years of American Life Have Been Uniquely Stupid. And in that article, after analyzing what I told you with the Babel metaphor, I said, well, there are 3 buckets of reforms that would help. And one is we have to harden our democratic and epistemic institutions to live in this new world. And here I was drawing on John's work very directly. But it's things like ending closed partisan primaries, which bring in the extremists. There are a number of reforms. John and I are both active in various democracy reform movements and organizations. So we have to harden our democratic and epistemic institutions. We have to make changes to social media and the electronic environment. Now, if you think it's hard to get through political reforms, which we've been trying to do for decades, wait till you try to get serious reforms of social media through both the U.S. Congress and the courts. This is why I'm not so hopeful about this bucket. An example of something which would really help would be identity authentication on social media. You can still post with a fake name, but in order to get an account, you have to show that you're a real person in a particular country. Now, I also think you should show that you're over a certain age. That's what I would like to see. Now, I understand it may be impossible for the Congress to mandate this for social media, but I would love to see a company, be it Twitter or an alternative to Twitter, that says, you know what, we don't have to do this, but we're going to do it. And if you want to be on a platform in which there are 0 bots and trolls, now maybe there'd be a few that would creep in, but if you want to be in a platform where people are actually authenticated, they're real people, and we have mechanisms to judge who is just a troll, a lot of aggression and no content, and those people are down. So there are all kinds of incentives we could use to make social media a lot better. It may not be possible to make them legally mandatory, but I'm hopeful that some companies will try. So that's just an example of how I'm thinking about solutions. The third bucket was we have to prepare the next generation for all this, and I already talked about that.
So like any good economist is going to wonder, what is the motive going to be for a social media company to make those kinds of changes? It seems to me that they're not going to do it out of altruism. There needs to be some incentive, right?
Exactly. That's right. So the business model developed by Facebook, originally they had no revenue, but then they developed with Sheryl Sandberg, they really developed the advertising-driven model where we get these amazing things for free and we pay with our eyeballs. And in that business climate, all that matters is engagement. So I don't think this could be an advertising-driven company. But people are beginning, and Elon Musk is beginning to realize, I think he realized long ago, a subscription model actually has very different properties, and he's trying to move people towards actually paying. What is it, $8 a year or something to have an account on Twitter? Or is it $8 a month? Actually, I forget. whatever it is. You pay something. So imagine, if most people hate social media even though they use it, or they find that it's bad for them even though they're fascinated, if there was an alternative platform that had much better dynamics and very few jerks, and you don't get called names for no reason, and people engage with your ideas, then market incentives would, if such a company flourished, that could then affect the way much of the rest of the industry operates. No, I agree. It's not going to be out of altruism. We need to figure out, and government can help incentivize things. We need to make certain other business models workable.
Anything you want to add?
Well, yeah, John Haidt mentioned that John Rauch is a little less pessimistic. And one of the reasons for that is I do see incentives in both directions. There are certainly incentives on social media to race to the bottom, as there always have been in media companies. American newspapers in the 19th century were a cesspool of hyperpartisanship and fake news. Why did that change? Well, it turns out, for one thing, that advertisers don't love to be presented in a cesspool of false information, garbage, trolling, and so forth. And the second incentive turns out to be that people hate to be in an epistemically polluted environment. You think it's bad not to be able to trust the air you breathe, try not being able to trust the news that you read. Being told to vote the wrong day on election day, for example. Being told lies about your school board. So people will tend to look for alternatives that are sounder and more institutionally stable and reliable over time. And that's exactly why Facebook, for example, until fairly recently, was developing a very robust trust and safety department and hiring 40,000 people to try to comb through there and get some of the worst stuff out. Now, we can argue about whether that method would ever actually work as opposed to other methods, but that was because they faced a commercial necessity to make Facebook a place where people want to be. Elon Musk, Facebook's had to pull back from that partly for economic reasons, but partly because a lot of conservative campaigners have done a good job of persuading the world that content moderation is a plot to silence them. It's not. But so, there have been advances and there have been retreats. But there are a lot of people in the social media world in places like Google who understand that if they're toxic to their audience, they will ultimately fail. I think maybe, I don't know Elon Musk, maybe some of you do. I don't know that he's a wonderful person, but he seems to understand at some level that if X becomes a place where you get horrible information and all the worst people are throwing mud at you all day, you're not going to want to be there. That doesn't mean the problem gets solved, but it does mean I think it can be a horse race. And I think that there are incentives to rebuild institutions that are attractive to people. I'll just wrap up by saying, okay, so what happened in journalism in the 19th century? Something took place between 1900, when H.L. Mencken, the premier American journalist of his generation, would brag about making stuff up and putting it in the newspaper because they thought it was fun and it attracted readers, to 40 years later, 45 years later, when you've got Edward R. Murrow opening the golden age of broadcast journalism. New York Times, very fact-based, very solid journalistic institutions. Actual humans made choices to do things in different ways. So in the early 1900s, you get the formation of the American Society of Newspaper Editors. The first thing it does is develop a code of conduct. Stuff like don't make stuff up, run corrections. We take it for granted, but someone had to think about it. You had the institutions of journalism schools set up, which began creating a process to inculcate people in norms. How do you do this? Is there a right way or wrong way? Professionalize. You had the development of prizes, like the Pulitzer, an early one, ironically by a yellow press baron, but nonetheless, it incentivized great reporting. You had people who, over the course of a couple of generations, created these new norms and institutions and attracted customers to them, so it paid off. Again, the question for all of you, as well as all of us, is how do we do that, something like that again? It won't be the same thing, but it will be about building new institutions and norms.
Let me shift gears just a little bit, and then we'll go to a Q&A. So you talked about strengthening our epistemic institutions, and I would suggest that as I look at, say, my own field, it is incredibly homogenous, tragically so. But a lot of faculty, there are certainly faculty who would just simply disagree with you, and they would say that the mission is all about woke or social justice. But I think most faculty would actually agree with you in principle. They would agree that we should have viewpoint diversity, it should be all about truth, we're trying to find viewpoint diversity. What they would say is, we just can't find any smart people who disagree with us, right? And there, you can see the bias happening, right? Where someone will come in who disagrees, and they find all these flaws in their work. Someone who comes in with whom they agree, all the same flaws are there, but there's a bias and they don't see it as much. And I think you see that among faculty a lot. So it's very difficult then to change and get viewpoint diversity in if faculty can't see past their own biases. What thoughts do you have on that? How do we strengthen these institutions if people are not consciously doing it?
Yeah, so I got into this line of work, or this topic, in 2011 when I was asked to give a talk to the assembled audience of social psychologists, actually in San Antonio. And I gave my talk on how there are no conservative social psychologists, and this is a problem for us scientifically. Here's how this is going to screw us up. And everyone in the room, I had everybody raise their hands if they're on the left, on the right, and 1,000 people in the room, 800 people were on the left, 15 were libertarian, 5 said they were conservative. I said, this is a problem. And guess what? I wasn't run out. There were 1 or 2 people who hated me for it. But overall, people said, yeah, you're right. Like, but where are we going to find these people? Well, how about if you think about undergraduates in a psychology class, if the professor makes occasional asides about Republicans or about, just some negative comments, students pick up that this is not for me. In the academic world, we are such experts on hostile climate. I mean, we really understand hostile climate, and we do everything we can, not everything, we do a lot to make it clear to conservatives, you're not welcome here. If you're going to apply for any job, you have to have a diversity statement, which can't be, I want diversity of viewpoints. It has to be DEI approved. And so universities now, especially in California, they literally will not hire you if you don't have progressive views on diversity. So I think, and I argued back then, I said, we're really shooting ourselves in the foot. Why would red state legislators trust us if we're all on the blue team and we're explicitly on the blue team? And I kind of warned my colleagues that in 2011, and I think the result is what we saw, what we see in the Gallup data. I mean, we've lost the trust certainly of conservatives and of moderates. So what would you do? Well, first, stop doing the hostile climate thing. Like, stop. Really, we have to have an awareness. Just as we, I'm sure professors used to make sexist jokes back, until the 60s and 70s. It was common to make jokes about, female co-eds or whatever. Like that, that stopped, and that's great that was right to stop that. So we have to stop the hostile climate. We have to. I think we actually should seek out. We should. Believe our own rhetoric here about the value of diversity and actually seek out people who have different viewpoints. They don't have to be conservative. Libertarians and centrists can really help because they also will question stuff. So it's not just getting the right mix. It's then we have to remove the fear. We have to make it so that if someone presents some theory or some interpretation of data and you think they're wrong, you'll actually say so. You're not going to be afraid of being shamed or called a bigot or a racist or a sexist just for raising a scientific question. So I think there's a lot we can do to create an environment much more conducive to free inquiry. And I think it was John, you used the word free inquiry rather than free speech is what we need. I agree. What we need is the freedom to question, to ask questions and to study topics. We don't need the freedom to say whatever we want, whenever we want, but we need free inquiry. So I think there's a lot we can do to make the higher ed more open to people who are not on the left and more welcoming, and to make people feel safer, I should say, in questioning dominant views.
Want to go to Q&A, or do you want to say anything else related to that?
I want to ask John a question.
Here we go.
I don't think I've ever asked you this, would you abolish the DEI bureaucracy at this point? Just get rid of it, root and branch?
So I've been thinking about this for a long time. And actually, I should know. So is this being recorded? Will this be put up on the web?
Yes.
Okay. So what that means is I just have to be very careful about sound bites because I can give a nuanced explanation, but if I say the wrong 4 words together at the same time, that's what it'll end up, and then there'll be problems. So my thinking really changed after December 5th, after those House hearings. And what I've come to see is that identitarianism is the problem. Right-wing identitarianism is like actual Nazis and Klan, and we see how terrible that is. And they think white people are the best and black people are the worst. But left-wing identitarianism is actually structurally very, very similar. It's just that they reverse it. Black people are the best and white people are the worst, and then everyone else is in the middle. And this whole way of thinking is just terrible. This is not something we should be doing. And to the extent that diversity is a valuable goal, it doesn't have to be identitarian. And we've been talking about diversity and praising it for decades. But something took shape around 2015, which was this new configuration of D, and especially the E, the equity and inclusion. Almost all of us in the academic world believe we should have diversity and believe that we should be inclusive of all of our students, whatever group they're from. But DEI kind of congealed as a very explicitly identitarian set of beliefs, and at the core of it, or at least in a lot of it, is Ibram Kendi style anti-racism. And so what I've come to think now is that the DEI bureaucracy is so gigantic and so entrenched in many parts of not just of universities but many other areas, and because it is identitarian, not all of them. There are some who really do it beautifully. In my experience, they tend to be Christians. There's a way to do DEI from a position of Christian faith that begins with love. But most of them are not doing it from love. They're doing it from this kind of identitarian, hatred of powerful people. And I don't think that can be reformed. I think that's the DNA of the enterprise. So I'm beginning to think, I'll just put this out there. This is a crazy idea, but I'll just put this out there and take my chances. You can't beat something with nothing. You have to have some way of helping people deal with various conflicts and misunderstandings. In some companies and organizations, they have an ombudsperson. An ombuds is really interesting. It's a person who is neutral. They're paid by the company, but they don't report to the CEO. It's a very special role where they're very skilled people. You go to them with problems, you're having a problem with your boss or with a coworker, and they'll help you figure out what to do. And it might be that you have to escalate and file charges. That might happen. But usually it's not. And there are other ways of working it out. So I just want to raise this as a hypothesis. What if not every school, let's get a few schools. What if a few schools take their, 1,000 DEI, or I don't know how many they have at Michigan. That's the biggest. But it's many hundreds and often many hundreds and hundreds of DEI staff. What if you cut all of those lines, and you take all that money, and you hire a number of ombuds people who, especially for the undergrads, they teach them skills of conflict resolution. They teach them how to solve problems, because what we have to do in college is we have to pass on people who are more able to be citizens than they were when they arrived. And I think sometimes we're doing the opposite. We're taking high school kids and we're teaching them habits that will make them unemployable, that will make them just annoying to work with, because they will think, like, if I hear anything that offends me, I have to have a way of reporting it, and someone in power has to take care of it. So that's again, I don't know that this would work, but I think I now am of the view that DEI, as it currently is constituted, is not reformable because it's identitarian. And so I think some schools should just have the guts to say, let's just try something new. And not just rip it out and say, everyone's on their own, we're not going to do anything, but try something new. Because clearly what we're doing is not working, and there's a lot of studies showing it's not just not working, it's not just wasting money. It actually backfires. It creates this feeling of walking on eggshells, teaching on eggshells, of people afraid of each other, because anyone can report anyone at any time for anything. This is like East Germany. I mean, this is not a way to live. So yeah, I do think that we need to try some major changes.
Okay, great. Why don't we switch over to the Q&A? So we have two of our research assistants at the First Amendment Center, Colin on this side and Morgan on this side. Thank you both. They are going to be our mic runners. If folks want to raise their hands, we'll start calling on people. Just Gentleman right in the middle with the glasses, yeah, stand up there. If somebody could pass the mic, we're going to have to pass the mics down the row, but he was so fast in ripping his hand up. We're going to let him go first.
Can we make a special request for anybody who disagreed with us? If you have a substantive criticism of what either of us said, please be among the first to speak, because that will actually help us.
Yeah, for sure.
Hi, this question is for Jonathan Haidt. I'd read the Righteous Mind book, and I try to create spaces for our students to have viewpoint diversity, but I'm not clear on what the benchmark would be for viewpoint diversity. For example, you used your story about San Antonio and asking how many in the audience was on the spectrum from left to right. And I guess the assumption it would be, ideally, there would be 50% here and 50% there.
No, you don't need balance, but you need diversity.
Okay, so in the moral foundations theory research, was there anything that would communicate, or any finding that would show that half the world is on the left of the spectrum and half of the world is on the right side of the spectrum? Is there any kind of conclusion like that?
Well, I think what you can say, speaking as a social psychologist, who taught Psych 101 and had to cover all the different areas of psychology, personality traits usually fall on a bell curve, and one of the main ones for politics is openness to experience, where some people are high on it. They tend to be attracted to progressive causes. They want change. Other people are low on it. They want stability. They want predictability. They tend to vote to become Republicans or be conservatives. Neither one is wrong. If you have a country or an organization entirely run by people who are progressive, it's going to fall into very predictable patterns of dysfunction. And if you have an organization that is entirely conservative, it's not going to become dysfunctional, but it's not going to adapt. It's going to be repressive in certain ways. So I really became a big fan. This goes back to my writing The Happiness Hypothesis and looking at ancient wisdom. It goes back to Heraclitus. It's like, the universe advances by the tension of opposites, like the lyre and the bow, or like male and female. There's all sorts of, like, in ancient Greek thought, like all over the world, like you need forces pushing against each other, and actually that's what John really points out about the U.S. Constitution as a way of creating the benefits of diversity. So to answer your question, sorry, this is too long. In every society, you'll have a bell curve of personality. The people who have the progressive temperament, they're the ones who are going to say, we need to change, we need to adapt, we need to try the new ways. And the people who have the other temperament are going to be saying, no, we need to go back to what our ancestors did and what the gods have told us to do. And that is a healthy, not conflict, but tension to have.
Great, thank you. How about over on the right there with the hand? Clayton.
Early in the talk, I heard Jonathan Rauch use the phrase the marketplace of ideas, and I've always struggled with that concept because in an economic marketplace, when a firm fails, it leaves the marketplace. But in a marketplace of ideas, because ideas are often free or low cost, they continue to arise even after they have been disproven or shown to be wrong. So I'm curious if you see at what limits we should be affirmatively excluding ideas that have been proven to be false, or Jonathan Haidt used Nazism earlier as an example. At what point are we justified in excluding certain ideas from the marketplace?
One of the signal inventions of science, broadly defined, I'm including enterprises like journalism and law that are also fact-based, part of the constitution of knowledge, is to paraphrase Karl Popper, we kill our ideas instead of each other. How do we kill ideas? We don't put them in jail, we don't murder them, and we don't forcibly exclude any ideas, but the great invention of the sciences is that they simply marginalize them. Once an idea has been shown to be false, or simply it doesn't pan out, it just kind of gets left behind. It's off the research agenda. People don't bother to check it. Sometimes they're wrong not to check it. It turned out in the 1980s, the speed of sound hadn't been checked for a century. When someone finally got around to checking it, guess what? It was wrong. So sometimes that's a mistake, but most of the time, it turns out the best thing to do with bad ideas that are misproven is just leave them behind. And in fact, if, I'm a gay guy, I get as offended as the next person, well, maybe not quite, but I don't like it when I hear homosexuality is a treatable disease or whatever. But we know that's false, and the way I deal with that is by ignoring it. And it turns out not giving these bad ideas the oxygen of constantly thinking that you have to confront them and bat them down or yell about them or claim that they're offensive or protest them, which is what happens on campus. It turns out there's actually kind of a magic in, when the provocateur, Milo Yiannopoulos shows up on campus, instead of 1,000 students descending the protest, he should greet a room full of crickets. And if that happens, his speaking fees go way down. So yes, we exclude ideas all the time, but we don't do it coercively. We just let them die on the vine off on the side.
Great, thank you. Next question. How about way up at the top, Morgan? Trying to achieve diversity of room position here.
First of all, just wanted to say thank you guys for coming out here.
you.
Really appreciate you guys taking the time for this.
You guys came and there's no pizza.
My name is Vid. I'm an economics major. You guys were talking about the changes you guys noticed in 2015 in academia. And I thought that was really interesting because I think I was probably too young to notice that, and I lived abroad. And so my question is in regards to the changes you guys noticed in academia before and after COVID-19. And as personally speaking, one thing that I've noticed is like an increase in demand for like instant gratification. What I mean by this, it's kind of tied to social media, honestly, because what I've noticed is that with social media, it's just easy. You can sit on it for 8 to 12 hours a day. It's easy. You don't have to put any work into it. And so that's kind of translated into like the workforce and other fields as well, where people don't want to work as hard to achieve results, and then they blame it on something that's completely unrelated. And so I just wanted to get your guys' thoughts on that.
Sure, and I have a very direct response to that. Thank you for that. It's an excellent question. So if we go back to 2019, if we go back before COVID, what is it that young people most needed? What Greg Lukianoff and I argued in the Coddling American Mind was that kids are anti-fragile. They need a lot more challenge. They need a lot more time. Younger kids need a lot more time outside with each other, and they need a lot less time on screens. Then COVID comes along, and what happens? We say, you can't go out and play with other kids because you'll kill each other with germs. So you stay home, and those screen time rules we had, those are out the window. You can be on screens all the time. And of course, this is just so horrible because kids were never in danger from COVID. This is one of the greatest public policy mistakes ever, was to treat everybody the same by age and not to recognize that it's the elderly who are at great risk and not the kids. In any case, what happened to my kids? They're 14 and 17. They were deprived of really a year and a half of education and time with their friends. They had to spend an enormous amount of time on Zoom, and they learned ways of coping. They learned ways of interacting through a screen. What the technology does is it makes everything available to us instantly, mostly for free and effortlessly. And when you learn that that's the way everything comes, well, that really interferes with your development. And teachers are noticing this, and employers are noticing this, that the pandemic generation, that those members of Gen Z who went through it, they need more help with things, they are more fragile, they're more anxious. So the causes, and then they think the cause was COVID. The cause was actually well before COVID, but COVID made everything worse. And I think we have to see past that. And one of the great things I find about Gen Z is that they're absolutely not in denial. I've been talking about this for many years. I've never found a Gen Z person who attacks me or says, you're wrong, you're terrible. No, most members of Gen Z agree the generation is in trouble, and that you actually would like to be held to higher standards and helped to meet them versus accommodated, given all the time off you want, whatever you need, we'll give you. So actually, let me ask the members of Gen Z here. So first, raise your hand if you're under 28. Okay, you're Gen Z. Would you rather work for a company that's going to be extremely accommodating and give you everything that everybody asks for? Would you rather work for a company that's going to say, Well, in the extreme, it'd be toughen up, Buttercup. We're going to help you, but we're not going to lower the standards for you. We want you to succeed. It's going to be hard. Some of you are going to quit. Okay, raise your hand if you'd rather work for the first company that's going to give you everything you want. Raise your hand. Raise your hand if you'd rather work for the second company that's going to actually help you grow. So there you go. So Gen Z really wants to grow, and the older generation is afraid to ask them to do it.
Wonderful. How about then up there, the hand, I don't know, the military dress, I think. I can barely see, sorry, these lights are really bright.
Hey, good evening, gentlemen. Thank y'all for being here. My name's Will Newberry. I'm in Navy ROTC. I'm graduating in May and going into the Marine Corps.
Thank you.
I have a question about if either of y'all's research has applied to the military at all. There's a lot of problems. The recruiting crisis, the politicization of the military. And I was actually very surprised when I went to boot camp before I came to UT 3 years ago in Naval Station Great Lakes in Chicago. I looked at the CNO's reading list of all the books we were supposed to read. They do a really good job of telling you what to read. And I saw how to be an anti-racist. And I was very surprised by that. So the military is not isolated from some of these ideas. And I was curious if y'all had any thoughts on the military's connection to all this.
I'll just start by saying I've heard there are various incursions of wokeness in some parts of the military. I've heard there are various incursions of Christian nationalism and right-wing, sort of MAGA stuff, both of which are alarming. In our modern era, the military absolutely has a telos, has a really clear, noble, inspiring purpose and very long traditions, probably the longest and most honorable. And there's pressures from both sides to corrupt the mission, leave that mission, focus on our mission on the right or the left. And boy, do we depend on the military to say no to both of those and to stay true to its mission. That's my first point. My second is, so my son is actually, he's applying to colleges, and he actually wants to do ROTC. He told me that the military is having a lot of trouble meeting its recruiting targets because so many young people are out of shape, overweight, don't want to go through it, don't want to do basic training. So of course the military as an institution is going to have to adapt to all these problems we're talking about here on the stage. Everything we've been talking about, the misinformation, AI, everything. What I've seen of the military, I've spoken at West Point a few times, what I've seen of it is that it is an incredibly impressive organization that is really, they have social scientists who are really trying to figure out how do we improve operational readiness. They're really focused on actual effectiveness. So I think the military is being buffeted by a lot of these, a lot of these trends that we're talking about. I think it's extremely good for young people to consider it. We just saw most of you want some toughening experience. That's something that my son wants. And so I hope that people will consider the military. But I don't know in the last few years really about what's been happening in the last couple of years. Those are just a few random thoughts. John, do you have anything to add?
No, it's a bit outside my area of knowledge. Thank you for serving.
Yes. So we'll do one last question, but it's going to be Sami Ayoub up here in the front, Morgan. But before he asks it, and while I have your attention, I'm going to draw your attention to two upcoming events the First Amendment Center is hosting, because I know the last question's asked, you won't listen to me anymore. So on March 5th, we are hosting David McCraw, who's the lead newsroom lawyer for the New York Times, along with some of the leading media law scholars in the country, talking about New York Times versus Sullivan and what's called the actual malice standard. In other words, how can news organizations be sued for defamation and under what standard? That will be at the law school March 5th at noon. And on March 4th, the day before, we are co-sponsoring a lecture by, Sami, am I saying this right? Anwar Iman, who will be talking about law and religion from an Islamic law perspective. And that's in the Patton Building, March 4th, 4 to 5 p.m. in room 1302E. I think both of those events are going to be very interesting if those are topics that you're interested in. So with that, Sami, ask a really brilliant last question. This is the last one, so it better be good.
Wow. Okay. Again, thanks so much for this conversation. So my question is in relation to the climate on campus, and I was wondering if you see any validity to to the claim that part of the problem that Gen Z sees on campus, or the so-called the politics of the self, is that the American public politics is just overdetermined, either on the right or on the left. As a result, people just, there's no other vision of politics to capture the kind of demands or maybe interests. For example, a possible conversation in relation to Israel-Palestine, foreign policy that's maybe critical, something like, or even domestic policy. It seems very difficult to have in either camp that you might be part of. And this is exactly why these guys do not read New York Times. They're much more interested in Tech Talk, other kind of intellectuals there, some form. And this is, I think, part of the problem, that not simply about knowledge issues, but also the kind of politics in society is not leading us to go somewhere from there. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll leave it to John to give the last word, because this is very much, I think, a John Rauch question. But what I'll say is that politics works best on the local level, where it's the outcomes that matter, not your performativeness. And de Tocqueville admired this about Americans, that when there was something that needed solving, you know, in France, they'd wait for the king to do it. In Britain, they'd wait for the nobility to do it. But in America, they go down and they say, we need a bridge here. How are we going to do this? Let's organize. Where are we going to get the money? And they do it, and they do it. And that's the great strength of democracy in America, at least traditionally. You know, what we've seen certainly in journalism is the complete hollowing out of local journalism. Everything becomes national. Now, national politics, you really can't affect. I mean, you know, maybe one person in this room is going to have an effect on them, but most of us, we're not, you know, we can yell and scream, but what we're really up to is just saying, look at my team, look, teammates, look how passionate I am in favor of our side. It's performative. It's not, I mean, it's an element of democracy, I suppose, but it isn't one that really helps democracy. And so to the extent that even now kids in middle school are drafted into culture war issues and culture war protests and activism, like, no, please don't do that. We should not be encouraging children to be activists. We should be encouraging them to learn about topics for years and years and years and understand systems before you try to change them. So this may not be a direct answer to your question, but I think I share your alarm that politics has become this high level, you know, not just net, but global stuff, whereas it'd be so much better, especially for young people, if they focus more locally, I think. John, what would you?
So yeah, we're 3 minutes over time, and we'd go 30 minutes over time if we got into the very important conversation about the political environment, the polarization crisis, the state of the two parties, the fact that the two candidates for president are about to be two people who most Americans really wish weren't running. It's a mess. But I will just say one thing in at least the general vicinity of your question, which is polarization and propagandization are two sides of the same coin. What is it Vladimir Putin is really trying to do when he targets America with disinformation? He knows he can't necessarily change our minds. That's really hard to do, but he knows he can divide us. He's very good at that. I would argue that certain leading political figures, including some ex-presidents, have also been extremely good at dividing us and do that on purpose. Why do they do that? Well, divided political opponents and publics are more open to demagoguery, they are more easy to fool, and they're easier to set against each other. That makes a divided public more susceptible to propaganda attacks. If I think that the other side, if I'm on blue-red and I think that Team Blue is trying to destroy our country, I will be much more vulnerable to targeted disinformation that tries to persuade me to do terrible things like riot. And the same is true in the other direction. So I'm going to just leave you tonight with a little advertisement. One way to make ourselves less vulnerable to the strategies of propagandization, some of which we've been talking about today, is to do what we can in our lives and communities to reduce polarization. Because the higher the level of trust goes in society, when we relearn to talk to each other, we are less willing to believe the crazy shit that's coming out of the TV and social media about the other side. I am an original board member, though no longer an evangelist, for a group called Braver Angels, a national grassroots depolarizing issue. We have volunteers in the room. Thank you. We have Braver Angels volunteers here. It is a national volunteer group, and it's operating on a challenging but very important and I think inspired business model, which is we can start in our communities to rebuild the bonds of trust to individuals, not to persuade each other, you're right, you're wrong, I'm right, but simply to hear each other, we leave the room in Braver Angels workshops and debates. The single most common reaction is we're not as divided as we've been led to believe. And that's true. All the evidence shows that we are not as divided as we've been led to believe. And we can reduce our vulnerability to the social media madness and the propaganda if we start doing the work in our communities with Braver Angels, and there are many others. There's one in your community, I guarantee you, where you can begin to rebuild those bonds of trust. And one by one, individual by individual, then group by group, and community by community, we have changed America that way before. Just ask Alexis de Tocqueville. We have a genius for it, according to him. We can do it again.
See how I wanted him to end?